This lecture is entitled Information on Demand, and the final lecture in the series will be given by Mr. Rose of the University of Bath next week, and his title will be Living with Computers. My title is Information on Demand, and the lecture is concerned with the use of computers for information systems. A conventional computer system consists of an input peripheral, an output peripheral, a central processor containing store, arithmetic unit, and control unit. Such a computer is used to process large batches of similar information. Each batch is prepared on, for example, perforated cards or perforated paper tape, and at a set time of the week or the month, the batch of information is processed, producing the desired batch of results. Usually, these results are produced on a form of high-speed printer. Such a system does not usually permit ad hoc inquiries or casual browsing through the stored information. With the introduction of the teletypewriter, a different type of computer usage has become popular. The typewriter is connected to the computer either by a direct line or through the telephone network. A computer user with such a device can interrogate the information stored in the computer at will without submitting his requirements to the checks inherent in the conventional batch processing system. The user can perform ad hoc analyses of the information stored and can select individual pieces of information for display on his typewriter. This new sort of application has been the subject of considerable discussion on television, radio, and in the press, and has resulted in questions in Parliament. You can see there some examples of what the press has been up to. My favourite is crystal ball service. This interest by the media in the application of computers is caused by the concern felt by the public that computer users having access to online systems will be able to examine at will the personal and private details of individuals whose data is stored in the computer files. My title, Information on Demand, is interpreted to mean, given that information on, for example, people, is stored in the computer, it is generally believed that this could be accessed immediately, at will, by some administrator or bureaucrat. A typical example of the sort of speculation which has been going on is shown in a recent front-page report in The Guardian. It was reported that a Labour MP had tabled 38 questions on the use of computers by the police. The questions were concerned with the use of the government computer to compile and store criminal and political records, and the use of the computer to speculate on criminal intelligence and intimate personal details. The article gives the impression that intimate details of all of us will be available on the government computer, to which the police will have access, and at the press of a button, the policeman could have all our personal details and some speculation about our possible criminal behaviour. I hope that this lecture will show just what is possible with current computer technology, and just how far, if at all, we are from realising the sort of nightmare that was being questioned in the House of Commons. One point which should be made is the tendency to sensationalise press reports. A different journal, not appealing to the general public, but reporting details of computer usage to professionals, gives an explanation of the use of one of the government's computers by the police, in which it is noted that the information stored is the same as that already held at central and regional record offices. The information consists of stolen motor vehicles, records of wanted and missing persons, and an index to the names of certain classes of criminals. Thus we can see that even the Guardian report is highly sensationalised, but the accuracy of the press is not the subject of this lecture. To see what is or is not possible with computers, we must first understand a little of the basic structure of a computer used for one of these online information systems. We can see from this slide that the centre of the system is the central processor, with a store containing instructions and the data currently in use in the computer. This store is called immediate access store and is thought of as being made up of a number of fixed locations, each of which can contain instructions or data. We will see more of these locations in a moment. Attached to the central processor, one or more typewriters. I've shown on this slide one typewriter, but in general there will be many. These typewriters are used in conjunction with a computer program to interrogate the contents of the central processor store. Also attached to the central processor, a backing store containing files of information. This is the normal place for permanent storage of information in the computer. Any information accessed from the backing store must first be found and then copied into the immediate access store within the central processor before the information can be used, and in particular before it can be displayed on the user's typewriter. It is not possible to use the backing store directly. Given a suitable computer, there are a number of further problems to be examined before we can have our online information system and have information on demand at our typewriter. Problems are these. First, we need some way of representing data in the immediate access store. Next, we need to collect together items of data into records. For example, items of data might be the characters making up a name and address, and a record would be a particular individual's name and the lines making up his address. Having a record, we then file away this record in the backing store. Usually we would copy the representation of data in the immediate access store away into our backing store. So for example, we could have a file of names and addresses in our backing store. Files with some logical connection are then collected into what is termed a database. For example, we could add a file of names and jobs, a file of jobs and salaries, and so on. These files, collected together with the name and address file, would make up a database of people, jobs, and salaries. Each of the files would be in some common agreed layout so that information can be shared between files and so that the appropriate records of different files could be linked together to form some more comprehensive records. This differs from the conventional batch processing in which each batch of information makes use of its own private file in its own private format. And combining of files belonging to different users or different departments is prevented both by the sequential scheduling of batches of work through the computer system and by the differing file formats. Finally, we need sets of instructions, that is, computer programs, to maintain and to search the files of the database. The maintenance involves keeping records up to date and making corrections to the data held. This may be a continuous process, collecting information from the typewriters, or amendments may be applied in batches at particular time intervals, as in a conventional batch system. Searching involves the location of a particular file within the database and the processing of this file to select individual records. This type of activity is initiated from the typewriter terminals and is termed information retrieval. Consider an inquiry coming in from a typewriter concerning names and salaries. That is, given a list of names, find the appropriate salaries corresponding to these names. Using our people, jobs, and salaries database, this would involve searching the name and job file to extract appropriate jobs, storing these jobs temporarily within the computer, and then using the job and salary file to extract the appropriate salaries for the jobs we found. Let us now go on and look at our first problem, the representation of data in the immediate access store. The immediate access store consists of two-state magnetic devices representing the binary digits 1 and 0. These binary digits can be used to code information within this immediate access store. This next slide shows how a number, say the age of an individual, could be represented. In this slide, I've used a dot to indicate a binary 1 and an empty circle to indicate a binary 0. So here, if we had the age of an individual 29 years, this would be represented by binary digit 1 in the rightmost position, then no 2s, a 4 in the third position from the right, an 8 and a 16, giving our 29. Each different pattern of binary digits, if you like, circles and dots, represents a particular number. On this next slide, we can see how characters can be represented by subdividing a location into 4 sets of 6 binary digits. This gives us a range of 64 characters, and thus each location can hold 4 such characters. In this example, we see the first part of a name. The name is Frederick Jones, and the first 4 characters, F-R-E-D, are in this first location. to hold all of the name Frederick Jones, we would need several such locations. If we wish to represent a photograph, then we could do this by making up a picture from a pattern of characters. We have here a picture of a well-known personality, and if you can see this sufficiently clearly, you'll see that it consists of various distinct characters. There are no continuous lines, there are no curves or anything of this sort. It's just patterns of characters to represent the photograph. If we could have this blurred slightly, perhaps it would make the photograph a little better. I think if it's blurred, then you tend to lose the distinction between the characters, and that rather improves the impression. Thank you. Even with this fairly crude representation of a photograph, we would require 1,440 locations of immediate access store, and that is packing the shades of light and dark in the most economical fashion possible into our locations of store. In most applications, 1,440 locations would be a very large amount of storage for one data item, for one person's photograph. If we cut down the number of locations used, for example, to 100, then we can have a photograph like this, even cruder still. Can we blur that one, please? I'm not even sure that blurring helps that. But that is 100 locations of store to hold a photograph even as crude as that. You can see now that in focus, you can see quite distinctly it's made up of minus signs, plus signs, and various overprinted characters giving solid dots. The problem with these photographs is that the discrete nature of the characters we're using does not allow us to have continuous shades of light and dark, continuous curves. And if we go on to more complex piece of information, for example to this, a fingerprint, then to represent something as complex as a fingerprint with reasonable accuracy would require many thousands of locations. Even so, it would only be a discrete representation of the continuous lines making up the print, and this would not approach the quality required for the rules of evidence for which a fingerprint would be kept. Let us, having looked at how we might represent data, such things as an age, a name, a photograph, perhaps a fingerprint, let's collect these together in a record and consider a record consisting of name, address, and photograph. Allowing 32 letters or characters for a name, we need 8 locations. 4 lines of address, allowing 32 letters or characters, 32 locations. And for a photograph, the better of the 2 photographs we had, 1,440 locations, a total of 1,480 in all. Perhaps 10 times as much as this would be required if we wanted to include even a reasonable shot at a fingerprint. Now let's turn to filing these records away in the backing store and have a look at the characteristics of backing store. In general, on backing store, we would copy away the binary digits in the immediate access store. So our data representation would probably be the same in backing store as it is in the immediate access store. This slide we see reels of magnetic tape, which is one of the most common forms of backing storage. These reels of tape can be either read or written in a serial fashion on a magnetic tape unit. The reels of tape go on the first empty spindle up there and are wound through read-write heads under the black part in the center onto the empty spool at the bottom. The thing I want you to remember about these is that we must use them in a serial fashion, reading the tape from the top reel down onto the bottom. It is not possible to select an individual record, an individual piece of data on a reel of tape. We must search in a serial fashion through the reel for the item we want. The other common form of backing store is a magnetic disc. We see here a pack of these discs being mounted on the read-write mechanism for the discs. This type of backing store can be used in a serial fashion, as with the tape, and it's also possible to select individual parts of the disc, individual records, if their position within the disc is known. Other forms of backing store exist, but the magnetic disc and the magnetic tape account for the vast majority of computer backing store. As an example of the capacity of a magnetic tape, we see on the slide 14 textbooks, but you can't see them as well as I can. They are Proceedings of Pure and Applied Mathematics, Anatomy of Skin, and Gulliver's Travels. Perhaps not a textbook. And if we were to take the text from these books, that is, excluding the diagrams, the photographs, and any graphic material, if we were to take the text from these books, then all of these books would fit on one reel of tape. I am, in fact, being a little generous there. I'm assuming the largest possible tape packed in the most tight manner possible. So I'm erring on the side of feasibility. To complete our information system, we now need methods of searching the backing store to retrieve information. Incidentally, we also need methods of maintaining the information, keeping it up to date, but I shall not discuss this additional complexity. Again, dealing with just searching, I'm putting a more favourable view on the problem than is the actual case. Let us think first of a reel of magnetic tape. I hope you remember that this must be used in a serial fashion. To see what this means in practice, imagine we want to find the address of an individual, Dean B. I hope Mr. Dean B is not here. If he is, I apologise for using his name, picked at random from the telephone directory. Suppose we know that Mr. Dean B is on the telephone, and we want to find his address. So I'm using the telephone directory as a convenient file of names and addresses. What we would do, we would take the telephone directory, open up at the D's, shuffle about a bit, and read off the appropriate address opposite the appropriate name. This is not possible with magnetic tape. If we store the names and addresses on magnetic tape, then we would have to read right through the file from the beginning. This is equivalent to starting with the first page, first line of the telephone directory, and having to read through every line of every page, all through the A's, B's, C's, until eventually we get to the D's, and so to D and B. Hence, in my slide here, if you can read the entries, that you can, I hardly can, you'll see that we're starting looking for Dean B in amongst the A's. We're down to ABC driving school, and that would be a very time-consuming business, but that's how we would have to use magnetic tape. Thus, you probably guess already that magnetic tape is only really suitable for computer processing where we have large batches of information, our conventional batch processing systems, and not suitable for our online inquiries from typewriters. Let's move on then and think about disks and how we would search disks. Well, we have the problem of knowing what position to look in for a particular item. We can use the disks in a serial fashion, or we can pick out a position of the disk. Now we could, for example, allow, say, 20 pages for all the A's, all the names beginning with A, 20 pages for the B's, 20 pages for the C's, and so on. And calculate a starting position for D, to look for D and B, by saying that we have to move on to the 30 pages, missing the A's, B's, and C's, one more page for the start of the D's. So we could calculate the equivalent of page 31 on our disk. We could say, perhaps, section 31 of the disk, and having calculated such a position, move to that position and start searching from there. To go back to our telephone directory analogy, we could calculate the position of the start of the B's and the C's in the telephone directory. Unfortunately, there aren't the same number of A's and B's and C's and D's, so if we're not to have empty pages, then perhaps we need some other technique. And an alternative would be to keep a table saying that the A started on page 2, the B started on page 14, the C started on page 50. So in addition to our file of names and addresses, we could keep an index showing us where to start in the directory. So then, if we're using our telephone directory, we could look down the index, see that D's start on page 78. That would then take us to the start of the D's, which is where we are on this slide. Then, having got to the start of the D's, we could read through the D's in a serial fashion, eventually locating D and B and reading off the appropriate address. So there we are, D and B. He's not likely to be here tonight, he's in Peterborough. You probably can't read that from there. This same technique can be used with a disk store. We can have an index to the start of each letter of the alphabet, and keeping the file in name order, jump to the part of the disk files containing the D's, and then search through the file, search through the D's till we find the item we want. As soon as we've gone past D and B and find there are no more D and B, say D and C, then we know we have the address that we want. Well, what does all this mean in practical terms? To try and show you the implications of this, I'm going to give you what we'd call a worked example. Let's discard from our record the photograph and the fingerprint and think just of names and addresses. Now let's suppose that we want to keep the name and address of every person in the country on demand. So surely this is not a big job. We might expect, say, a government agency to have the name and address of every person on their computer system, and sit down their typewriter and be able to get, say, the name of a person living at a particular address on demand on their typewriter. Well, if we're to have information instantly available, we must keep it in the immediate access store. And if we remember that for our name and address, we needed 40 locations of immediate access store, and assuming there are only 50 million people in the country, then we need 2,000 million locations of immediate access store, and at current prices, one location costs £1 sterling. That's what it costs us, 2,000 million pounds, to have our names and addresses immediately available, instantly available from the immediate access store. This 2,000 million pounds is 10 times the annual cost of the health service, or half the cost of defence, or half the cost of education. And I am ignoring the fact that it's not yet technically feasible to build a store of this size for general usage. So clearly, using the immediate access store and having files available instantly on demand is quite out of the question. So let's turn to our backing store. If we use reels of magnetic tape, then our 50 million name and address records will require 125 reels of tape. Each reel of tape costs roughly £20, therefore £2,500 to file all these name and address records in the backing store of the computer. This ignores the cost of collecting the information, creating the tapes, that means using the computer, and considers only the cost of the materials, that is the cost of the tapes themselves. Clearly, £2,500 is not a large sum for storing 50,000 records. However, if we remember our tape drives, we have to read in a serial fashion from one spool of tape to the next. And having put information away on our tapes, we must then search tapes to find the information we want. To use a record of information, the record must be first found on the tapes, transferred to the immediate access store, and then, for example, it could be printed on the inquirer's typewriter. Let's consider being given an address and wishing to find the names of the occupants of this particular address. Assume that we keep our files in name order, then it may be necessary to search through all 125 reels in a serial fashion to find the particular address we want. Sometimes we'll find a group of names of a particular address in the first few reels. On other occasions, we'll have to read right the way through the last of the 125 reels. Assuming that we expect people living at one address to have the same surname, and thus we only have to look on one reel of tape, and expecting on average to search through half our reels of tape, should we say for convenience 60 reels of tape. I know 60 isn't half 125, but it makes my arithmetic easy. Assuming we look through, say, 60 reels of tape, then it takes 10 minutes on the computer to read through one reel of tape at a modest cost of £50 per hour. We can see that reading through our 60 reels of tape, we would wait 10 hours at our typewriter, and it would cost £500. Thus, clearly, it's impossible to have files of names and addresses kept on reels of tape and still have information on demand at our typewriter. The obvious answer, even with today's rail costs, is to go and knock on the door and find out who lives at the address. I've perhaps unfairly done the more difficult of the two examples. If we were given a name and had our files in name order, or wanted to locate the address corresponding to this name, then perhaps if we knew the first name on every tape, we'd only have to search one reel of tape, 10 minutes, roughly £10. However, let's consider the other common alternative, magnetic disks. We would require 500 disks for our 50 million records, and a cost of roughly £100 each. The bill for materials for filing our records would be £50,000. Again, not a very large sum. Assuming, as before, that we keep the files in name order, but wish to find the names of people at one particular address, then again we must search through each disk in a serial fashion. On average, we would expect to search through 250 disks at roughly one disk per minute. It's just a free glimpse at a disk being searched. And 250 disks at one per minute, and assuming £50 per hour, is roughly 4 hours and roughly £200. Again, this is clearly out of the question. We wouldn't be prepared to wait 4 hours sitting at our typewriter to find the name and address of a person. It would be cheaper to knock on the door and not much slower. Again, if we pose the other problem, given a name and our files in name order, find the address, then it will be considerably cheaper because we store the files in name order. In a disk, this might only take seconds, given that we knew which disk to use. Remember, though, that we've dropped from our records such niceties as photographs, fingerprints, and in fact anything other than our original name and address. And if we were to put in photographs, then these figures would be considerably increased. So we can see that the Fourth, that we might have a national register of names, addresses, photographs, fingerprints, in which we could search for particular fingerprints to try and find the name and address of the individual owning that fingerprint, or to search for the name and address of an individual from a particular photograph. These things are clearly impossible with today's technology. What about tomorrow, though? How is computer technology changing? We've heard from previous lecturers of vast increases in the performance characteristics of computers, meaning either more powerful computers will be available at the same sort of prices, or computers similar to those in use today will be available at very low prices. We will consider, therefore, the characteristics of computer performance. These will be the speed of arithmetic within the central processor, the size of the main store, the immediate access store within the central processor, and finally the backing store available in terms of disk files attached to the central processor. This graph shows on the horizontal axis time starting in the 1950s, passing through the present time, and presuming to predict a few years ahead. That's not quite as far as 1984. The graphs shown are for a particular brand of computers, selecting, in each case, a medium-sized computer from the middle of the range of alternatives available at a particular date, and in each case, a general-purpose computer. So I've avoided any extremes, and in particular, I've avoided special-purpose computers built for particular research projects and not available on the open market. The vertical axis shows an increase in the particular factor considered. For example, the figure 10 indicates a tenfold increase since 1950 on either the number of arithmetic operations which can be performed per unit time, the number of locations of immediate access store available, or the size of the disk files that can be used in conjunction with the central processor. Similarly, the figure 20 indicates a 20-fold increase since the 50s, and so on. I think the graph shows very clearly that considerable progress has been made in the speed of arithmetic, of the arithmetic and logic unit of the computer. It also shows that continuing progress is being made enlarging the size of the immediate access store attached to the central processor. However, the rate of increase of disk storage is modest, and until some breakthrough occurs in mechanical engineering, it is likely to remain modest. Our immediate access store and the speed of arithmetic are determined by the progress in electronic engineering, whilst the disk performance is largely determined by progress in mechanical engineering. If we look ahead a few years, we can expect the speed of arithmetic to improve very greatly, and the main store to increase substantially, the disk store to increase perhaps only by a factor of, say, 10 compared to the 1950s. Thus, in the near future, we may have computers which are considerably faster and can hold much more current data and many more instructions for the problem they're working on at any one moment, but the problems of backing store are not expected to be removed. What then is the conclusion we can reach from the proposition that we may have information on demand? Simply this. Either we may store vast quantities of information but not search them fast enough or cheaply enough to enable us to have information on demand at the typewriter. We can only use vast quantities of information in the same batch processing manner as is already done now in conventional computer processes and, for that matter, in manual processes, with all the inherent checks and balances imposed by built-in control procedures, audit trails, and the like. Alternatively, we can have information on demand, but we must be prepared to accept a limited coverage, that is, a limited record size, such things as fingerprints, photographs, probably out, and a comparatively few number of records, nothing like one each for all the people in the country. And this is what is being done in the particular computer to be used by the police for their wanted and missing persons and their index of particular classes of known criminals. Notice that it's not only must we limit the coverage, but it's probably not even feasible yet to store such common things as fingerprints. Why then, if this is the conclusion, why then the continuing debate about information systems based on computers? Since we know that either they cannot be used by the casual inquirer at his typewriter, or they cannot be used to include a very large number of records. Well, the problem is this. Every file we keep in a central computer system increases the possibility of the invasion of the privacy